Hello everyone and welcome back to the Data Vault series. Today we're going to be looking at our creation sequences. We'll be looking at how to create entire entries and then also how to create certain category mappings within each entry. So we'll start by doing just the create entry, which creates an empty block just to allocate space for this new entry for our new website, say, and then we will also be doing the creating of entry data. Modification will come later on. Okay, so for creating an entry, we're simply going to be taking in as input a name, the name of the entry. And then there's really only going to be two steps here. The first one is going to be to insert it into the name map. So the two things that we have to do here are, well, one, we have to complete this whole mapping here from our name to an ID to an index. So we'll first have to generate an ID for the name, and then find the next index in the file that we can use as our initial block. So we'll start by inserting it into the name map, and all that's going to be is just call insert the key value pair of name map to ++ max ID. So max ID will just be some application variable that we will store in the application structure, and this will be inserted into name ID map like so, and that's all that is. And then for the second one, we want to create the initial block. So we want to actually allocate the space so that it exists. There's something that the program can track, and also just so we reserve a block for the actual entry itself, so that if we were to create another entry, we wouldn't be creating two entries at the end of the file and we wouldn't know which is which. So create the initial block. So to create the initial block, we're simply going to get the index. So initial block will just be the file length of data.dv, because we're going to be adding it at the end, divide by 16 because each block is 16 bytes. So we're just getting the number of blocks here, +1, just because we want to add it at the end. And then we're going to insert this initial block into, well, I guess I can put that as another step just for completion, or just for organization. So that'll be step 3 actually, insert into index map. And that'll just be insert the key value pair of max ID, because that's already been incremented. It's incremented before we take the value. So the current value max ID is going to be the ID for this name, and then init block will just be the value that we calculated over here, and insert this into the IDX map. Now for creating the initial block, we're going to generate we're going to generate some characters. So we're going to have the block is equal to, so the first thing we're going to say is the first character will be a 0, because our category IDs start at 1 and they go on from there. So there's a 1 for the category ID. So the block will be a 0 to denote that there is no category. And then we're also going to have random bytes. So random bytes, and I will have 11, and we will have 11 random bytes. And then the next block, since there is no next block, we're going to have a 0. So the small endian value of the 0 integer, which is 4 bytes. So the random bytes here, the reason why we're doing this is because if we just had all zeros, that would be 16 zeros. And that could be a little easier to try and crack our encryption, because with a known input of just a bunch of zeros, the output of AES, I don't want to say can become more predictable, because it cannot, but you just have more of a definite input to test keys with. So you could test you could test a block of 16 zeros and just keep encrypting it until you match what is in the file. So that's why we're doing random bytes here, so it is unknown. But this will not be read, it won't matter, because this block here is a 0. Or the category ID is a 0. And then we're also going to increment the data initialization vector, because we are using the CTR method. We need to increment the initialization vector every round, or not every round, but every block. So we need to increment it up to initial block. So we'll say increment by initial block. And then write AES encrypt 256, K is equal to the data key, the text is equal to the block, and then the IV is equal to data IV into data.iv, or .dv, sorry. And this should be append, actually. And then once we have written it into data.dv, we can then insert the value into the map, into the index mapping here, and that's what we have. And that's how we'll be able to access it now. So we have a complete continuation between the name, which was mapped to an ID, and this ID was mapped to an index, which is now just an empty block that we wrote over here. And then the next sequence we're going to talk about is creating entries. So we'll create an entry data. Input for this one is going to be a name, for the name of the entry, the category that we want to input, and then the new data. And there's only really going to be one step here. Well, I guess I can break this down. In my reference here, I have it as one step, but I guess we can break it down into a few steps. So the first one will be find the category ID. So we'll say cat ID is equal to category ID map category. And if cat ID is equal to 0, so we didn't find it, and that's why we also want to start the category IDs at 1, just so 0 can represent an invalid number. So we'll say we need to insert this into the map, essentially. So insert category mapped to the plus plus of max category ID into category ID map. And that's this is also just the same methodology of inserting a new entry where we increment the ID. And then we should actually, just so we can keep this variable here, we'll say cat ID is equal to plus plus max cat ID beforehand, and then just insert the category ID that we have there. So that's the category ID. And then now we need to find the entry ID. So once again, we're going through the process. So the ID is equal to the name ID map with name name, and if ID is equal to 0, then we did not find the name. So we're going to return null. Well, actually, if we don't find the name, then we can actually we'll call the create entry. So call create entry sequence. I'll just have that in here. So we'll just return that. If you, let's say you just wanted to create an entry and you don't have, or if you wanted to create data and you don't have the entry yet, well then if you call it on an entry that does not exist, it will automatically create it for you. So this will call the create entry sequence. And then this, I assume, or I'm going to say will return an index or the ID here. So ID is equal to that. And if when we create the sequence, or when we create the entry, this ID will be mapped to the final index in the index map here. Okay, and then step 3 will now be to we're actually going to initialize our cursor, and we're going to start writing the data. So write data. So we're going to start by initializing our current block. So current block is equal to ID IDX map, passing in the ID. So the entry ID will be mapped to the block that we want to start at. And then now what we're going to do is, for iterating through each block, we're going to go through this little process here where we take the continuation block and then continue on. So we're just going to have a while true loop here. So while true, we're going to increment data IV. I'm actually going to have another variable called previous block is equal to 0. Just so we can know how much to increment data IV by. So increment data IV by current block minus previous block. And then at the end here, at the end of each iteration, we are going to say previous block is equal to current block, and then we're going to update the current block. So update, and we will go into detail about how to update the current block. So first thing to do is increment the data IV. Then we're going to actually decrypt the block, because right now it's encrypted. So block is equal to AES decrypt 256, using the data key. The text is equal to, I'm going to define another function here called a block, which will just get a 16-byte block from the passed in file. So block is of data.dv, and then the index of this block will be current block. And then the IV here will equal data IV, like so. So once again, there are a few methods like block, like file length that I had over, it was over here, yeah. And so these will be just utility methods that we're going to define, but they do exactly what they say. File length will get the length of a file. Random bytes will generate a number of random bytes. And then block will access a block. Okay, so that's the block variable. And then we're also going to have another Boolean variable to keep track of whether or not we actually modified this block. So modified is equal to false. Because we could, for example, we could start an entry. So like in this first block here, we start a new entry 2, but the data continues on into the next block. So what we have to do is we may have to modify multiple blocks, so we're going to keep a Boolean variable if we modify it or not. So here we're going to say now for each character in the block going from 0 to 12, the indices, because we don't want to take we don't want to modify the last 4 bytes, which is the index of the continuation block. So we're first going to say the category is equal to the character. That's just the start of it. We identify the category immediately. And to create the data, we're going to have to find where the category is equal to 0. So we are not worrying right now about modifying data. That will be another video or another sequence that we'll worry about later. But right now we're just saying there does not exist a data mapping for this entry for the category. So we just need to find the category when the category is equal to 0, which will be the end of the current entry. So if category is equal to 0, then we're going to say the block at the character. So I'm doing a lot of short form, and I'm not doing accurateness, but block at character just means, I guess we could just say for I goes from 0 to 12, just to make that a little better. So character now becomes block at I, and then block at I is equal to now the category ID that we want to add, so cat ID. So in essence, we're looking for, let's say we're in this block, so this is the last block, and we see a 0 here as the next character. So we want to overwrite this 0 with a category ID that is a valid category. So the block is a category that we're setting this character to the category ID, and then if I does not equal 11, we can write new data into the current block. So write new data into the current block, into block going from I plus 1 to 11, or to 12, non-inclusive. Because we want to start after the category ID and we want to go until the 12th character, or right before. And then here now we're going to set modified is equal to true. So now that we've written the data, if there's more data, once again, I'm using a lot of short form here. I'm not completing my if statements, but that will happen in the code. So if more data, then we're going to go to the next block. So we need to say next block is equal to the file length of data.dv divided by 16 plus 1. So if we have reached the end of a block, so if we have reached, so let's say that we have a 1 there, and then we input a bunch of data, and we have more than 6 characters. This is going to be a 0 here because there's no more data in this entry, so we need to add it on to the end. So that's why we're getting the file length again. So next block is that, and then the block at 12 to 16. So the continuation block for this entry will then be that next block. So small endian, the small endian value of next block. And then outside of the character loop, we're going to say if modified, then we need to write the data. So write AES encrypt, K is equal to the data key, the text is equal to the block, the modified block, and IV is equal to the data IV. And this is also incremented. We have it over here. And this is going to be into data.dv at current block. So we will go, there will definitely be a video on file IO methods and inserting into a file specifically at indices, and we'll talk about how to do that. And then if we have more data, then this next block value, this next block integer will not be 0, so we need to update the counters. So if next block does not equal 0, then we're going to update our counters now. So previous block is equal to the current block, and then current block will just become the next block. And then in the next iteration of this loop, and then we're going to have an else statement here, actually, that just says break. Because if the next block is 0, then there's no more data to write. But here we have the previous block is equal to the current block, and then we set the current block to the next block so that we can still increment the data IV in the next iteration by that difference. And yeah, so that is data creation. That was our mapping, or our category creation. In the next video, we're going to look at accessing data, and then we will start looking at modification and deletion of that. And then we'll start writing some code. But there might be a few intermediary videos of writing utility code beforehand. Yeah, until then, hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a good one.